Hi everybody, it's Mr. Poser, your human anatomy and physiology teacher. Today we're going to be starting our new unit, which might be the last unit in human anatomy and physiology, which is on the urinary system. So we should have, in my class at least, gone over every other system in my YouTube playlist and in our curriculum, and this should be the last one. So in this video, we're going to talk about the main functions of the urinary system, including how it regulates the extracellular fluid and intracellular fluid compositions and regulates osmosis. So the main functions, we're going to talk about the kidneys, and we're going to talk about the main units of function within the urinary system, which is called a nephron. And we're going to talk about the parts of the nephron and do a little anatomy there. All right, so here we go. Let's get into the urinary system. Here's its three main functions, the three ways that the urinary system maintains homeostasis. A, it maintains the composition, pH, and volume of bodily fluids. So I'm going to be talking a little bit more about this on the next page here. But this is number one. This is what it does. Your cells, every single cell needs to make sure that the composition of water and solutes outside of the cell is similar enough or manipulated in such a way that there's a balance between the fluid on the outside of the cell and on the inside of the cell. And it's your urinary system's job to make sure that those cells are maintained, or the fluid around the cells and inside the cells is maintained in terms of their composition and their pH. So we're going to talk about that again in a little bit. And the other main thing that the urinary system does, it removes metabolic waste and foreign substances. So in your pee, yeah, we're going to be talking about pee here, going number one. What is in your pee is, well, metabolic waste and things that your body decided that, hey, we don't need to keep this. So your kidneys, the main organs within your urinary systems, those are going to be deciding, like, in one way or another, like, okay, here's what's in your blood. What do we want to keep? What do we want to throw away? What don't we need? What do we need? How much of it do we need? And it's your urinary system job to determine that and regulate how much is kept, how much isn't kept. And by extension, it decides, okay, what should be in the extracellular, intracellular fluid, what should not be, and maintaining the composition of those fluids. Also, second thing here, kidneys also control red blood cell formation. So I imagine at this point of the year, we have talked about blood and what red blood cells do, and the kidneys help to make those. So, hooray. All right, so let's talk a little bit more about the main function of the urinary system, which is to maintain fluid composition. Okay, so here's why fluid composition needs to be maintained. And this goes back to the whole idea of homeostasis, right? Even though things are changing, the external environment changes constantly, the internal environment needs to maintain a steady state, aka homeostasis. And this is what the urinary system does to contribute to that. The body is constantly gaining and losing water and solutes, okay? So I am losing water right now. I'm losing water through my breath. I'm losing water. My hands are a little sweaty. I don't know. But you constantly lose water, and you need to be gaining water back. You've heard this before. Like, everybody needs to hydrate, right? We'll talk about that a little bit more later. But you also gain and lose solutes. You gain solutes from the food you eat, and you lose solutes from, going number one or going number two. You lose solutes that way. Okay, so the amount of water and the amount of solutes, which are substances that are dissolved in water, is constantly in flux. Okay, and as every other organ system does, it has to maintain certain balances in order to, well, keep you alive, right? And that's what the urinary system does. The job of the urinary system is to balance extracellular fluids, so fluids outside of the cell, and intracellular fluids. So we're going to call that the ECF and the ICF, the composition of extracellular fluids and intracellular, outside and inside. Okay, and why that's so important is because there is a physical property of all sorts of dissolved substances and fluids, which is called osmosis, aka diffusion. Okay, so it's diffusion. Osmosis is the motion of, or the diffusion of water, or as I've defined it here, the motion of water through a membrane based on concentration gradients. So you may or may not, if you've taken like AP Biology, we talked about this a lot in Unit 2, but if you haven't learned this before, I'll give you a little crash course here. If you have, then you're very familiar. But check it out. I have two beakers here, and what do beakers have to do with the urinary system? I'll show you. Okay. One side is water, and the other side is salty water. And if I have what's called a semi-permeable membrane, meaning that some things can go through the membrane, but other things cannot, very similar to a cell membrane, what's going to happen is that water is going to move to an area where there's less concentration of water. Okay, so there's much more just pure water on this side than there is on this side because there's salt in this water. So salt water has less water than fresh water, right? Because fresh water is just water, or distilled water is just water. So what's going to happen here is that if salt can't pass through the membrane, it's what makes it semi-permeable, but water can, water is going to go from or the left side to the right side so that there's an equal concentration of water on each side. Okay, so water has a natural tendency to do this, right? To go wherever the solutes are and balance things out. Okay, and the urinary system has to make sure that your cells don't lose too much water and they don't gain too much water. Okay, because that is very, very super important. All right, and the main organs that are going to be doing that are the kidneys. They are the main organs of the urinary system. Where they are, there's a fancy word for where the kidneys are located. They are retroperitoneal. They are on either side of the vertebral column on the posterior wall of the abdominal cavities. All right, so picture that for a second. Either side of the vertebral column, you have two, right? And they are on the posterior wall, which means they're on the back of the abdominal cavity. So in other words, they're back here, right? They are below the thoracic. They're in the abdominal cavities. That means they're below the thoracic cavity, and they're behind all the other like digestive organs, like your intestines and your stomach and your liver and all that kind of stuff. Okay. So yeah, there they are. Here's a picture, the overall view of the urinary system, and here's the microanatomy of the kidney, which we'll be looking at in a little bit. Okay, so let's look at the parts of the kidney here. I'm going to be labeling this diagram. Follow along with me if you have your own diagram, which I hope you do. So yeah, here we go. Let's start from the outside. The outermost part of the kidney is called the renal capsule. You're going to see the word renal here quite a bit. Renal is just referring to anything having to do with the kidney. So the renal capsule is the very outside or the covering of the kidney. Okay, and then there's three distinct layers within the kidney. You're going to see, you've been in this class long enough, you found out that like a lot of things in the human body, there's three layers to it. And that's true for the kidney. Okay, so the outermost layer, so this kind of pinkish looking color here, where all these blood vessels are running to, that is called the renal, where is it? There it is, the renal cortex. Okay, so the cortex is the outermost layer here. The renal capsule covers the cortex. All right. Then moving inward, we start to see some more action here, and we're going to be looking at this a little bit more in detail when we study the nephron. This is called the renal medulla. Medulla means middle, so medulla, whatever. But it goes renal cortex, renal medulla, and there's going to be some action that's happening in there. I'll talk about that in a second. Okay. And then the innermost part of the kidney here is called the renal pelvis, and that's actually labeled over here. So this white-looking thing is called the renal pelvis. And as you might be able to tell, it kind of looks like a tree a little bit, but what the renal pelvis is, it's a big funnel. Okay, so like a funnel that you use to, you're pouring one thing into another, and a funnel kind of collects it and then, streamlines it a little bit. And that's exactly what the renal pelvis is. It's a big funnel. Okay? And the renal pelvis has different tubes that kind of, funnel into it. And each one of those is called a calyx. And the plural for that is calyces. Okay? So this is a minor calyx, and these are major calyces over here. They're kind of like funnels that go into funnels. And these triangular-looking structures over here, which are bundles of what we call collecting ducts, which we'll look at in a second here. These are called renal pyramids. Okay, so from the renal medulla, urine is collected from the cortex and the medulla, and it's funneled into the renal pelvis through the calyces. What these are renal vessels. Okay, so you have a renal artery and a renal vein. Your arteries obviously carrying blood away from the heart, and this is blood that needs to be filtered out still. And renal vein is going to be bringing blood back that has been filtered. Um, yeah, so there's your renal vessels, and finally, the last structure on here is a ureter. Ureter. I'm actually not sure if it's ureter or ureter. I'm gonna have to come back to that. But this is the tube that leads from your kidneys down into your bladder and then out through your urethra, so you can go number one. All right, and just double checking to make sure I got that all right, and I did. Yeah, so there's your anatomy of the kidney, and we're going to talk more about these structures here momentarily. All right, so a little bit more about the kidneys. Blood enters the kidney through the renal artery and it exits through the renal vein. It passes through a system of similar vessels to filter out excess substances and metabolic wastes while retaining needed substances. So, if you've ever heard, I actually have a page about this coming up. If you've ever heard of somebody or know somebody with kidney failure, they have to visit a particular clinic in order to access a machine that does the job of the kidneys for them if their kidneys have failed. And do you know what I'm talking about? Well, that's kidney dialysis. All right, so dialysis machines, their whole job is to, well, do what the kidneys do, and it's to kind of, quote unquote, I'm going to use air quotes here, to clean or filter your blood to make sure that we keep the things that we want and we get rid of the things that we don't want. We pee out the things that we don't want. Okay, so the whole job of the kidneys is to take your blood, right, and sort through what needs to be kept and throw away what doesn't need to be kept. Okay, so it filters out excess substances and metabolic waste, and that's what ends up in your pee. Okay, so as I was just saying, dialysis machines are used for patients with kidney failure, and I'm covering it up with my face. And it does the job of the kidneys for the patient. So anybody with severe kidney failure has to go to a dialysis clinic in order for their blood to be cleaned, in other words. Okay, so this is a hemodialysis machine, and hemo means blood. Okay, so we're going to talk about the nephron here, and we're going to study the anatomy of the nephron, and then we're going to wrap this up. Substances extracted from blood in the renal arteries are collected in nephrons, which are defined as the individual filtration units in the kidneys. So your kidneys are the organ that does the filtration. All the individual units that collect all that filtering. Those are called nephrons. Each kidney has 1 million nephrons. Okay, so what we're going to look at is the series of tubes here that go through the renal cortex and the renal medulla, and their job is to, well, filter out excess substances and metabolic wastes from your blood. Okay, so here we go. Let's talk about the nephron. All right, so this is a nephron. As we can see, there's a collection of blood vessels that travels throughout, and it travels in conjunction with these tubes here. Okay, and I'm just gonna, for the sake of time here, I'm just gonna show you my completed diagram of the nephron. Okay, so where we begin here, this is called an afferent arteriole, meaning that this is a smaller version of an artery that's going to be carrying oxygenated blood, and it's going to get clumped up and kind of bundled up in this ball of yarn called the glomerulus. Okay, and the glomerulus is where filtration occurs. So the glomerulus is going to filter out a lot of these substances that are, well, a lot of the substances from the blood. Okay, whether it's still needed or not. Okay, and I kind of drew these arrows here to show the motion of that filtrate that's taken out from the blood. So it's collected in what's called the glomerular capsule, so this circular structure here. And the filtrate is going to be going throughout these tubes. First, it passes through the proximal tubule and then descends from the renal cortex into the renal medulla via the nephron loop. And what's happening here is what we're going to talk about in our next video. So that what's filtered out from the glomerulus is kind of travels through the medulla, and this is where the kidneys are going to decide, okay, what do we keep, what do we not keep, and it's going to use concentration gradients to do that. Okay, so it goes through the nephron loop, and then it passes back into the renal cortex and passes into what's called the distal tubule. Remember, proximal distal. So the distal tubule then descends into what we call the collecting duct, and a lot of different nephrons, they kind of deposit all into communal collecting ducts, right? So at this point, what we have, we don't call it filtrate anymore. We call it, well, urine, because urine is, It's what we don't need, right? And from this point in the glomerular capsule to the collecting duct, your kidneys have done a couple other functions here to decide what to keep and what to throw away. And the urine is, its final product here. This is what we're throwing away, and this is what we don't need. Okay, so there's the efferent arterial, meaning that this is the blood that has, this is the blood that has been filtered. Okay, for lack of a better word. And what's exiting the collecting duct is urine. All right, that'll be it for this video. We're going to talk about the main functions or the main 4 processes that happen in the nephron and how urine is formed and how it's eliminated in the next video. We'll see you next time.